Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Abington High School Board meeting for Wednesday, June 19th. This is, of course, a national holiday, Juneteenth, because on June 19th in 1865, the black slaves in Galveston, Texas learned that the war was over and that they were freed. And so June 19th became the day of commemorating emancipation. So with that, I'm going to ask everybody to rise and pledge the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Didn't we have somebody sitting in that seat over there? There he is.
Thank you for sharing with everyone.
Yeah. Mr. Drella, please leave your shirt on. That's all we ask. Okay, roll call, please, Mrs. O'Day.
Mr. Abdella.
Here.
Mr. Azar.
Here.
Mrs. Henderson.
Here.
Mrs. Hillebrand.
Here.
Mrs. Karam. Mr. Moran. Mr. Robeson.
Here.
Mrs. Tierney.
Here.
Mr. Acker.
Here.
All present.
May I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Abdella.
Yes.
Mr. Azar.
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson.
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand.
Yes.
Mrs. Karam. Mr. Moran. Mr. Robeson.
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney.
Yes.
Mr. Acker.
Yes.
9.
May I have a motion to approve the minutes from the meetings of May 5th and June 5th?
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Azar.
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson.
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand.
Yes.
Mrs. Karam. Mr. Moran. Mr. Robeson.
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney.
Yes.
Mr. Abdella.
Yes.
Mr. Acker.
Yes.
9-0.
Are there any board reports at this time? Mr. O'Donnell, you got your hand held?
No, I'm wiping up water. A little pool going down.
Okay, we got it. In that case, we're going to move on to the superintendent's report.
Thank you, Mr. Acker. Towards the end of tonight's meeting, the board will be voting on the final general fund budget. However, prior to that, I've asked Mr. Mirabelli to provide us with an updated overarching presentation. And this is to kind of follow up on his last presentation on our preliminary budget.
Go ahead.
All right, so we have talked a lot of budget over the last 6 months or so. Coming in tonight with a brief presentation, but we'll take an overview look at it. While that's sort of warming up, is it coming on?
It is.
Okay, just taking its time. So I guess I would start by saying this was a very challenging budget, and in fact, we were threading the needle in a lot of ways here, working through the end of stimulus funds with $700+ thousand rolling off, and maintaining staff that we hired with those funds. It doesn't look like I'm getting the screen I was expecting there. Well, I don't have any graphs and charts, so I could just keep speaking if that's okay, just in the interest of moving it along. So In a lot of ways, we had a lot going against us in this budget, right? We had a lot of capital needs coming up, right? So we want to do some financing there, which of course takes some additional revenue to take care of. We had those stimulus funds expiring, as I said, with those ongoing positions that were in the budget, some of which we were able to remove by attrition, but some that remain with the enrollment that has gone up over time. So we did have actually $816,000 in ESSER staffing costs that we had to absorb. Capital needs in next year's budget, we have $342,000 of additional debt service going in. That's about a half of a year of the new bond and a piece of the loan that we had taken out, the $1 million loan. That number's actually down from what we were projecting the preliminary budget. Once we came in with the successful bond sale, we lowered the debt service payment accordingly because it was a little bit cheaper than the original conservative estimates that our experts came in with. Across the board, we had employee salary increases of 3% on the support staff, the professional staff, administrative staff, confidential staff, so across the board, 3%. So that was a total of $1.247 million in salaries and benefits added to the budget that we also had to contend with. Special education costs went up by $860,000 or 11% year over year. That does include some of the salary number that I just mentioned before because the teachers are in the special ed category as well. I want to note that we had to add one MTSS position and one special education teacher, both funded through medical access funds, so we're taking care of federal reimbursements, and we should be able to sustain that for about 2 years until we need to find another solution there. Transportation costs, as we all know, continue to rise, so we're working through some negotiations there. Medical insurance costs are an emerging, they always seem to be an emerging issue, but more so now than ever, with a lot of RX and specialty drugs now becoming an issue. So that's something we'll have to tackle in the future, maybe look at some creative solutions and collectively bargain some solutions there. And then on the slide I have inflation, inflation, inflation. Everywhere we look, Sue was just buying paper today, copy paper today, and it's, what would you say, it was about double that we were paying 2 years ago. So it's, everything's sort of going up, and we're just grappling with that and, how to keep the budget as flat as possible, not always as easy as it may seem. So those are some of the reasons that we had to thread the needle here to come up with a relatively balanced budget. So those are the challenges, but we did have some budget opportunities come up. And the first thing was we had the highest Act 1 index on record at 6.2%. And that is helpful in bringing in revenue to the district there. And pending your vote tonight, we will realize that revenue to help us with our operating budget as well as our capital needs going forward. We also had real estate millage appreciation of 1.06%, which is helpful. That raises revenue without raising taxes. Interest earnings on cash deposits and investments. You'll see when I read the treasurer's report in a few minutes. We have a lot of our resources tied up in U.S. Treasuries. And we have preserved year-to-date, we've earned about $700,000 year-to-date in the general fund with U.S. Treasuries, which is very significant. So now we're coming up with strategies on how to preserve that for next year and possibly a piece of the year after. We are highly invested right now, so we can't just go grab a 2-year bond. So we have to sort of wait until our cash flow cycle resets in August when the tax payments start rolling in. But we are going to work to try to preserve those earnings for as long as possible should we see some rate cuts coming in. We also have a basic education subsidy increase above what we've budgeted it's out there.
What'd you say?
I haven't said a word.
I've just offered my. There you go, done, don't touch anything.
All right, so we're on to the opportunities section of the presentation. It's hot.
Seriously.
We'll make it through. We'll make it through.
Save yourself.
So,
We
but
only
the,
have to
but,
leave it on until the pledge.
so we were referring to the potential basic education subsidy increase. We've put 3% assumed in there. We could get as much as, I believe it was 7 or 8% in the governor's proposal. They're working through that in the state legislature, and we're hoping for a positive result. You know, we assume based on experience that it'll be past June 30th, but you never know. It's been a little quieter, and you don't hear a lot coming out of the Capitol. The other thing is possibly even more significant is there's potential cyber charter tuition reform, tuition savings. If they were to cap the tuition rate, the state estimates we could save about $395,000 in tuition costs there. Certainly not something we're taking to the bank. We forecast it as if it was business as usual, but that could be some help that's coming our way as well. And the other thing that helped is the PISA rate staying flat. It actually went down by 1/100th or a tenth of a point, which is not a huge deal, but when we're used to ramping it up percent after percent after percent every year, it is nice to have the PISA rate stay flat at 33.9% of salary. So those are some of the possible budget helpers. I also wanted to go over some of the changes. Since we talked about the preliminary budget, I just wanted to highlight a few changes we've made since we last spoke about the preliminary budget. At your last meeting, I believe it was your last meeting, you approved the Mets custodial contract. And that sort of just got us up to date with rates and things. But one of the main things is as our staff leaves through attrition, we need to replace with positions there. And we thought the most effective way to manage the high school night shift was to allow Mets to put a working manager in place there. And this way, they would keep an eye on the staff. They would also be working and cleaning. They would be the backup for anyone who's out. So that was a position that was added to the custodial contract. And really, that was paid for by attritional savings on the in-house custodial staff side. But that was an adjustment we made between preliminary and final. We added the MTSS position, as I noted earlier. We increased the medical access payments by $145,000 to account for that, to pay for the 2 special ed positions that we're talking about. We decreased the debt service payment, as I said, after the successful pricing. And the earned income tax trend continues to go upward, so I adjusted that revenue estimate by $50,000 to the good. And then your final budget at a glance, you can see that the full document is in your folder and has been available for public inspection as well. But overall, we're looking at revenues of $57.4 million versus expenses of $57.7 million. So a minor deficit of $291,000 is not too bad, all things considered. You know, if some of those good news things break our way and we're able to manage our expenses during the year accordingly and stay within the confines of our budget or maybe drive it down a little bit better, I can see us breaking even and creating that positive cash flow that we need to go toward, you know, debt service and things like that. One risk I will say, though, and reiterate, is that medical insurance. Those claims are high. We do have a buffer in the medical insurance trust fund, but that will only last us so long if we keep having bad years. So I just want to note that, you know, we could erase this deficit, but we do have sort of maybe a sleeping dog might not be the right term for it, but I just want everybody to be aware that those medical claims are something that we're keeping a close eye on. So that's the budget in a nutshell. Quick overview. If anyone has any questions, happy to.
Jim, does the budget, as you put it together, have any contingency in it at all?
We did have a $300,000 contingency in there, a reserve for transportation costs, and we're working through identifying what those costs will be. We think it'll be comfortably within that number. Hopefully, on the lower side of half of that, but we're working through that currently, and I'm not at a point where I can say what that number will be.
So the one thing I just want to highlight is in these numbers, the amount of the bond issue that we just did, that's in these numbers, the debt service, you said it was a half year of that.
Yeah,
Debt
so
service.
one basically principal payment and mostly interest, minor principal and mostly interest.
And the total dollar amount of bonds that we've raised so far is what?
Just under 10 million. It was like 9,995.
And so the interest expense that's in this relatively balanced budget, small deficit, certainly relative to recent history, right? But the interest expense that's in there is only a portion of the interest expense on the bonds that we just issued, which are only 10 million, correct?
You said the only interest.
The only interest expense of the bonds that we would issue to do the facilities work in the future. The only interest expense that's in this budget is the interest on the bonds that we've actually issued so far, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So we get into forecasting next.
Next, right.
Yes.
Right. So then all the other bonds that we have to issue in the future that will have significant interest expenses that we have to pay for eventually are not in this budget.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
But that's what comes next. So, following this budget passage, following the state budget passage, we'll immediately get to work in modeling out what the next 10 years look like. And Chris and I have at least bi-weekly conversations on what these projects are lining up to look like. And, so looking at it constantly, and we'll come up with the most accurate forecast we can with those, I believe conservative interest and principal payments over time. We'll work with our experts to make sure that we have, we can give the board a really good idea of what they really can afford.
Right.
To your point, Mr. Azar, this budget, I'm sure some of the other board members would agree that this is one of the first budgets I've seen that's basically, at this point in time, pretty much neutral, pretty much balanced. And I think while that may give us a false sense of good things, I think what Mr. Azar is saying is we have a lot of expenses in the future that are going to be coming in the form of debt service, and it just means we're going to have tight budgets. We're going to have to be very careful how we budget and how we spend. It's not a situation where we say, well, we got a balanced budget, we can go out there and have a good time. We really do have to be careful.
You're correct. And when I talk about managing the budget, that's trying to spend under what you've allotted here for yourself and stay under it and within it, not create new recurring expenses to the extent you can. Sometimes you just don't have an option, as you know. If kindergarten crosses that 26, 27 mark, we have a long history of putting a teacher there. So there are a lot of things, special ed is one, that are just not avoidable. But to the extent we can control the budget and make sure every dollar is going into the operation to the places it should, and we're getting the most bang for our buck, being efficient, those are the things we look for during the year. When a proposal comes out, we say, is this necessary first? And then you say, is this the best value for the dollar? And what impact are we going to get? Does this align with our values and our mission? And as long as you keep that guiding light, you can usually manage pretty well. We do have a lot of needs, as we all know. So we're doing the best we can to address those needs, but stay fiscally responsible and be as lean as possible, which is, threading the needle is kind of the term of the evening for me.
So threading the needle is an understatement. When we have these conversations, like I talked to Jim, it's somewhat like three-dimensional chess. We have been very aggressive in our pursuit of grants. We have been very aggressive in ensuring that we are efficient in optimizing all of our resources, so anytime that we can catch some air, we can fill a void. So by that, I mean, for example, we took out last year at this time a $1 million loan. And we were able, through grants and investing that money wisely, able to get 25% more, meaning we are able to purchase 1.250 million. And because we were pretty judicious and strategic with that, one of the things that we did that was supposed to be on next year's budget was a dump truck, right? And I know what you're thinking, like a dump truck, right? I didn't know they were $90,000, right? I mean, I knew that they're expensive. I didn't know that they're that expensive. And like everything else, inflation with this, right? We were able to purchase that dump truck through shrewd investing and just some going after some grants. So then we were able to kind of offset that and think about filling some other maintenance needs, right? Simultaneously, we're taking a look, if you look at the Treasurer and Bills report, while I can't project next year, we're always keeping an eye on the wage tax. That's something that is an indicator for me of the overall economic health. In fact, our Act 1 index is tied to the SAW, which is a statewide average weekly wage, right? And I believe I said in a previous meeting, I think over the last 3 years, earning income tax has risen by close to 27%. But we're also very cautious that that doesn't mean that we take a look at the recent trends and budget for that same pattern occurring. That's how you get into trouble. But it's also been one of those things where that allowed us to realize some surplus. In addition to that, if you take a look at the interest line, which you should, on the Treasurer and Bills report, it's huge. It's huge. And that's another strategic area. You may not have noticed it, but over the last couple months, we've made some investments going 2 years out. And I know this can sound somewhat boring at times, but over the last 2 years, we've made a lot in interest when a lot of other school districts have not, because we've been able to take advantage of an inverse yield curve, meaning that we're getting high interest rates over low terms, right? So we're investing 6 in 1 year and getting 5%, which is something, and Rod, correct me if I'm wrong, or anybody in finance here, you just did not see that. There's plenty of money managers that are probably Rod's age, my age, that did not ever see that in their career. So now we're at the point, and Jim gets a lot of credit for this, is every year we're getting to this point and we hear, okay, this is going to be the year, we should think about that in our budget, but then here we are grabbing more interest. But now we're taking a look at, can we do a cash flow analysis? What do we have to invest over the longer term? So if the rates for short-term investments, say a year, drops down to 3, we've locked in millions at 5.5 for 2 years. So these are the strategic decisions that we're doing to pull $30, $40, $50, $100,000 out of every budget cycle to account for some of the unexpected things. And as Jim said, we'll have a discussion a little later, not only in public, but with our consultants about insurance. And if you've talked to anybody out in the public or private sector, this is not just a Abington Heights thing. Insurance is very challenging, and this is something that we are going to have to deal with and figure out what some of those strategies are to kind of mitigate some of the steep losses. We're fortunate that we had, or did have, a $6.5 million balance there, and we discussed at some point whether that was too much. If I give you 3 years of trend data, you will not say that that is too much. So, you know, I want to thank Jim publicly for the job that he's done, bringing us in to where it is. And I also want everybody to realize it's a daily task, just looking at every single number, thinking about where we're seeing sunlight, where we're seeing darkness, where there's a grant or an opportunity. So, thanks a lot.
So the other thing I was gonna build on, you mentioned grants and interest, but the other thing, and when I talk about managing budgets, we treated that, or we continue to treat this $1 million loan as if that's its own separate budget, right? So how many hours did Chris spend on the phone trying to negotiate the new fitness room at the high school? Like, that stuff didn't come in under budget by accident, right? It's like these things got value engineered, negotiated, bid, quoted. Sue did a lot of bidding and quoting for us. Dr. Vitale did some bidding and quoting for us. I remember a lot of work with the barricade and things like that. So all of these, there were a lot of help here. There was a lot of help driving down costs, getting the most value out of that $1 million. And I think you see when we reintroduce the list of all that was accomplished, you'll be pretty proud of what we got done with $1 million. So anyway, I digress, and I thank you again for the time, and I'll see you for the treasurer's report.
Mrs. Tierney?
Jim, real quick. What is the tuition? What do we expend per pupil?
So we have yet to calculate, we will calculate the tuition rate probably in July, but it will come in somewhere around $12,000 for a regular ed student, probably 23, 25 to a special ed. Now you see our special ed costs went up, so ours will go from probably 22 to 25. That's where I'm estimating right now.
How much more is that than it has been?
Let's see, we actually budgeted for it level because even with the cost increase, we were able to drive down by bringing people back in the current year. So it's level from a budget to budget perspective. There's going to be little impact. There will be a big impact if it goes down. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but budget to budget, it's.
And how are we doing with this current year, with all the numbers coming in?
It looks like we'll be below budget in the current year, which leaves us some room to leave that line item flat and let the natural growth happen there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hang on, we may have a question from Mrs. Karam.
Who are you trying to call? Yourself? Want me to try?
Mrs. Karam, do you have a question? Okay, any other questions for Mr. Mirabelli? All right, in that particular case, we're going to move on to the public comment. Is there anyone that wants to make any particular public comments tonight? Mr. Mirabelli, you're smiling. You want to? No, he's good. Okay. In that case, let's move on to the action discussion items. And for that, I'd entertain the treasurer's report. And I believe, Mr. Mirabelli, you're up again.
All right, pinch hitting tonight here. We started the month of May with a total cash balance of $19,060,000, collected local revenues of $1.51 million, state revenues of $2.463 million, and $66 million in federal revenues, for a total cash available of $23.1 million. Net disbursements were $2.952 million for a total cash balance of $20,147,906. If you look just a little bit below, though, you'll notice just how much we have invested of that $20 million, almost $17.5 million in U.S. Treasuries, which is requiring, it looks like there's $2.8 million left. That's literally a payroll in a bill list. So we are running as close to zero as we possibly can. Credit to Janice downstairs, the Assistant Business Administrator, who's watching this daily and helping us monitor the cash levels. You know, we certainly won't be bouncing any checks here, but we are trying to get as invested as we can here to earn every possible cent in interest that we can.
Could you just say again the federal money that came in, because you actually misspoke and said that we got 66 million from the United States federal government?
66 million?
And I would
Oh, that
love
would've
if we got
solved
that
all
much
of our
money from.
problems. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for calling
want the record
calling
to
that out. Yes,
reflected.
66,000, which is significantly less than the number I had cited previously. My apologies.
Can you also, I believe on the treasurer's report on the page before that report is a budgetary review. Can you just comment on the budgetary review year to date?
Yeah, so there's a lot happening on the revenue side. You'll notice that the real estate tax revenue came in at about $400,000 plus over budget, which is a good thing, right? So we do build in there about $300,000 in contingency in case, you know, a few major players don't pay their bill for but so we do have a conservative estimate there about where we expected it to come out. Again, you do need those conservative markers so that you can come out on top if something doesn't break your way. The other one I'll point out, the wage tax that Chris referred to earlier. We finished the last year at $5.145 million, budgeted this year 4.8. But you can see how far ahead of last year we are this year, 3.8 versus 4.1. So we're about 300,000 ahead of pace of last year. And where it's not an exact science because there is timing of payments involved, it is not unreasonable to say that you'll come in $300,000 over last year's estimate, and that you'd be somewhere around 5.4 million, which would help you by about 600,000 better than budget there. Okay? And this is something we've spoke about since the beginning. We thought we might have been a little conservative as we saw the returns coming in. So again, unexpected as of last June, but not unexpected throughout the year as we monitor this. Real estate transfer taxes tapering off a little bit. We certainly expect to hit that budget mark. Delinquent tax, again, tapering off a little bit. Could be timing of payments, but also a combination of maybe people paying on time, right? So I think we have more people paying on time, which is a good thing, right? It's a good indicator. Interest, you can see we already collected $618,000 in interest as of the end of May. That's where that $700,000 estimate comes from as of the end of the year. And we will comfortably beat that number by about 275,000. So there's some good revenue news on that side. You know, on the state side of things, we did receive about $400,000 more in state subsidy than we thought we would. So these numbers are starting to add up, and I think I itemized them in the last presentation. But they're starting to add up to some good news to minimize that deficit. On the expense side, we're really spending at right about where we thought we would, right? So, and we also had a couple investments that we made. We waited to see if we had the money, if things were breaking our way to make those curricular Chromebook type investments at the end of the year, and we were able to do so. So you'll see a little bit of a jump in your expenses in the July report, but certainly within the confines of the expense budget. So when you start out with a deficit of about $1.6 million, you can see where I'm of the belief that we'll do better than break even in the current fiscal year.
Probably come in with a positive budget.
That is my expectation.
Very good.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much for your good work.
Appreciate it.
You're managing it so that the surprises we get are in the right direction. So thank you to you and Dr. Schaefer for keeping your eye on the ball.
The whole team at the business office is doing a great job as well.
Okay, can I have a motion to approve the treasurer's report and the bills?
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Henderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand,
Yes.
Mrs. Karam, I can come back to her. Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam on the treasurer's report?
Treasurer's report?
Mr. Acker?
Yes,
9-0.
thank you very much. Dr. Shaver, can we have the personnel report?
Sure, Mr. Acker, I'd ask that the board consider a motion to approve the personnel report as presented.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Hillebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
Yes.
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes,
9-0.
Mr. Acker, I'd ask the board consider a motion to approve the June 2024 volunteer list.
So moved.
Second.
on the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Karam?
Yes.
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes,
9-0.
Mr. Acker, I'd ask the board consider a motion to approve the high school science curriculum.
So moved.
Second.
on the motion? I'd like to thank Dr. Vitale and the curriculum committee for doing a great job on this.
Really, the teachers were so supportive and really, really kind of the catalyst for all of this, so thank them as well.
It takes a team.
For sure, thank you.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes,
9-0.
Mr. Acker, I'd ask the board consider a motion to approve the middle school science curriculum and resources.
So moved. Second.
on the motion?
I have a question on the middle school Elevate modules.
Mhm.
Could you share with us what that is?
Absolutely, so part of the curriculum rewrite was to look at high-quality instructional materials, and we vetted multiple materials and resources. Elevate, which is Savas Learning, which is Pearson of what we would know of it. So what we liked about Elevate, let me backtrack. So in science, you can either teach a survey course where you teach a little bit of physical, a little bit of life, a little bit of environmental, or you can teach kind of 6th grade is earth and space, 7th grade is more physical science, and 8th grade is more life science. Our teachers were more comfortable doing that, and what we liked about Elevate Science was we were able to pull out those modules and not teach a survey course like some school districts do, but really specialize in one of the science domains. That price is high. It is a 6-year cost, so we are buying all of the science resources for 6 years. So basically, this time next school year, I'll tell them we need 300 workbooks for every grade level, and they send them and there's no cost. So Mr. Mirabelli and I spent a significant amount of time kind of back and forth of what's the best way to do it. It's a big ticket item. I was able to negotiate with the company that we will spend half of that in the 24-25 school year. The other half of that will be the 25-26 and keep that cost, and it would be interest-free. So it's going to be 2 payments, but just like the Amplify Science, it was a heavy lift, but it's a 6-year cost. So you will see no annual cost for science K-8 now.
This is for K-8?
This is for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade
s-
specifically.
oh, middle school, right,
Yeah,
right.
when we approved the elementary, that was K-5.
Okay, thanks, Maggie.
Absolutely, thank you.
Roll call, please.
Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hildebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
yes,
Mr. Moran? Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Thank you.
Mr. Acker, ask the board consider a motion to approve a new bank account for Abington Heights School District Series 2024 Bond Construction Fund.
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hildebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
yes,
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mr., Mrs. no, I'm sorry, Mr. Acker.
Yes.
Motion carries 9-0.
Mr. Acker, ask that the board consider a motion to approve the Abington Heights Middle School estimated budget proposal for production, staff roles, and responsibilities for the 2024 musical Matilda.
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hildebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
yes,
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Mr. Acker, ask the board consider a motion to approve the proposal between Abington Heights and the Residence Educational Consulting.
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hildebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
yes,
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Mr. Acker, ask the board approve the agreement between Abington Heights and the Lackawanna College for dual enrollment.
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hildebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
yes,
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Mr. Acker, ask the board consider a motion to approve the 2024-25 homestead and farmstead exclusion resolution.
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Hildebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
yes,
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Mr. Acker, ask the board approve the 2024-25 Special Education Services Agreement between Abington Heights and the Graham Academy.
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Karam?
yes,
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hildebrand?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Mr. Acker, ask the board consider a motion to approve the agreement between Abington Heights and Acorns to Oaks Consulting LLC to provide school psychologist services.
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hildebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
yes,
Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Mr. Acker, ask the board consider a motion to approve the agreement with Abington Heights and Aviana for a backup one-to-one nurse for a student in the MDS program.
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdallah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand,
Yes.
Mrs. Karam,
Yes.
Mr. Moran, Mr. Acker,
Yes.
9-0.
Mr. Acker, I'd ask the board to approve a memorandum of understanding between Abington Heights and Lackawanna County Head Start to provide student services.
So moved.
Second?
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Tierney,
Yes.
Mr. Abdullah,
Yes.
Mr. Azar,
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand,
Yes.
Mrs. Karam,
Yes.
Mr. Moran, Mr. Robeson,
Yes.
Mr. Acker,
Yes.
9-0.
Okay, I'm going to ask for, request the board to approve the addendum to the superintendent employment agreement for Christopher L. Schaefer.
So moved.
Second.
On the motion. Roll call, please.
Mr. Abdullah,
Yes.
Mr. Azar,
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand,
Yes.
Mrs. Karam,
Yes.
Mr. Moran, Mr. Robeson,
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney,
Yes.
Mr. Acker,
Yes.
9-0.
I'm also going to ask, request the board to approve the agreement between Abington Heights, excuse me. Ask the board to approve the addendum to the assistant superintendent employment agreement for Dr. Maggie Vitale.
So moved.
Second?
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Azar,
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand,
Yes.
Mrs. Karam,
Yes.
was that a yes?
I don't want to answer, I feel.
Swallowed some water, she said yes.
Kelly's like, yes.
Oh, I said yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
She said,
Can you not hear me? I said yes.
she said yes.
Right, I'm like, I can't answer that question.
Mr. Moran? Okay. Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdullah?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Mr. Acker, I'd ask that the board consider a motion to approve the transportation agreement with Roar, Inc. to provide transportation for students attending the 2024 Extended School Year Program.
So moved.
Second.
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
Yes.
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdullah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Mr. Acker, I'd ask the board approve the transportation agreement with Branich Busing, Inc. to provide transportation for students attending the 2024 Extended School Year Program.
So moved.
Second?
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Hillebrand?
Yes.
Mrs. Karam?
Yes.
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdullah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Mr. Acker, I ask the board consider a motion to approve the final general fund budget for the fiscal year 2024-2025.
So moved.
Second?
On the motion? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Karam?
Yes.
Mr. Moran? Mr. Robeson?
Yes.
Mrs. Tierney?
Yes.
Mr. Abdullah?
Yes.
Mr. Azar?
Yes.
Mrs. Henderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Hillebrand?
Yes.
Mr. Acker?
Yes.
9-0.
Okay. Is there there's no informational, information at this point in time. Is there any unfinished business? Is there any new business? I'd like a motion to approve. I'd like a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you all.
Bye, Emily.
Thank you, Emily.
Bye, Greg.